back in the day, Nicole's OOCSS, object-oriented CSS, gave us a lot of concepts that have become modern CSS development. A lot of the methodologies that have come since are based on Nicole's work, from design systems, which you called style guides back in the day, and utility classes, which you called modifiers, and components, which you called objects, all sorts of these ideas. You picked the wrong names. So it's a failing on your part.
Totally.
Yeah, okay. But Nicole is also heading to the World Championship for para rock climbers after this. She's a caller for visually impaired climbers, and I didn't know what that meant, so I looked up videos, and it's wonderful. Go check it out. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. Can I just say, I just got to be introduced like that by Miriam, like the goals right there. So I'm here to talk about CSS masonry layouts today. It's something that we at WebKit are really excited about and trying to figure out how it should work. And I wanted to come and share some of that with you. I wanted to start, though, with why in particular I want to ask you. Have you ever joined a company and they have some sort of like twin language going on? They all say some weird thing, and you're like, who says that? That's so strange, right? In particular, this one was at NPM when I worked there. If you were agreeing that someone could ship something, all you did is post a little sheep emoji on it, and it was good to go. So like Miriam was saying, I was a web developer for more than a decade. I built some of the early design systems and basically love the web so very, very much that I wanted to go work for browsers. I lived and breathed CSS every single day, and I knew exactly going there what I wanted to make happen. I had all these ideas. And so 6 years ago, I made that happen and actually started working on browsers. And then the team used this abbreviation, VC. And I was like, what can that possibly mean? And I didn't ask for a little bit because I was like, surely this should be something I should know and I'll figure it out. And I thought, does it mean like, I don't know, venture capitalist? If we're in the Bay Area, maybe that's what they're saying. But no, it did not. And then like my history of French language came out and I was like, WVC? Is that it? And no, so it doesn't mean toilet. It turns out it meant video conference. And when I finally figured out what it meant, I was like, I will never say that. That's such a confusing abbreviation to use, right? And then one day, what of course did I do? I used it without thinking. It just passed through my head like it was a normal thing to say. But that was actually a really like sort of special and important moment of me working on browsers, because that was the moment where I knew I couldn't trust my own intuition anymore to figure out what the web needed and required to move forward. And that's the day when I really started to facilitate conversations between folks in the community building stuff every day, whether it was framework authors or someone making a cool library or someone who did a demo that I was like, I didn't think you could do that with that. And getting those people talking to browser engineers so that browser engineers are getting that firsthand knowledge of what developers are trying to do. So in a way, I'm grateful for that word VC, because it really was that aha moment where I knew that I needed to start asking a lot more questions. And today, obviously, I'm going to talk about masonry layouts, and I have a ton of questions for you. So what you're going to see is I have stars on my slides. Black stars are for when developers already gave us feedback, which is thank you, kudos. And rainbow stars are for where we'd like more feedback. Although, of course, if you think something is interesting, like send it our way. So first, what is a masonry layout? People think of like bricklayers and people, sort of laying bricks side by side. And it's kind of like that, but it's also kind of like if you turn that on its side, only also not. And some people call it a waterfall layout because the water sort of flows from the top to the bottom. That I guess is particularly popular in with Asian developers. And so I don't know if any of these metaphors really work that well for understanding what this does. So I think Masonry may be one of those things where you know it when you see it, and so you just need to see it. Pinterest is obviously the sort of canonical example. This is the one everybody thinks of when they think of a Masonry layout. You have sort of equal width columns. Each one has pictures accompanying text. And then the height of the content varies, but the width is steady, and so you're able to tightly pack the information. Another cool example is the Halcyon theme for Tumblr. I really personally love this one because I think not having a bunch of white space really lets the art and the content and the color come forward. Rita Lemden did this cool thing with a Masonry layout where she added these neat little like fluttering animations, like they were little pieces of paper fluttering in the wind of the scroll. And I thought that was lovely. Obviously, if you're going to do animations, think really carefully about how that'll affect users who are sensitive to motion. Beyonce has Masonry even. So if she does it, we should all do it. So what I like about this is that she really combines these like super glossy images of herself looking completely glamorous with like casual shots and like her kids and her regular life. And I think using a Masonry here gives it like a collage-y feel, almost like you're looking at her scrapbook. And I think that's great for a personal website. One thing to know about Masonry is it does sacrifice the bottom edge. You're going to end up with a jagged edge at the bottom in order for the content to flow up. But in a case like this one, they actually made the jagged edge part of the design, and I quite like how it turned out. Masonry can obviously be used to show off product images, and that sort of goes way beyond a basic grid with everything lining up. This one's really neat. So Christian Hammerstad's site uses Masonry with some neat animations when they flow in. And so you start seeing the images appear, and so you get a sense of like their cartoon style. I will say this could be very close to my stuff hasn't loaded, and so you're waiting, so you have to be super careful if you play with that. Jen Simmons also built this cool mock-up that works in Safari Tech Preview now as a potential site for the National Gallery of Art with the goal of showing off what a Masonry layout could do. And I think it's got awesome maximalist wall art vibes, so I like it. Horizontal Masonry is a thing too. It's a little weirder to kind of wrap your head around, but it can be used to make a sort of double row carousel, allowing users to explore content in like a more, I guess, more casual way. So we've seen some of what Masonry is, but I think it's important to know what Masonry isn't as well. I thought that the Google image search results would be a Masonry page, but actually it's not. The reason being because when you add additional items, they flow to the bottom and you scroll vertically. So this is much more like a Flex layout. It's really perfect that I followed Josh since he gave you all a bunch of Flex tips. Flickr, again, it looks like it would be a Masonry, right? Because you have all the pieces sort of fitting in tightly to each other. But on Flickr as well, when you add additional content, it actually flows to the bottom. Those rows are a fixed width. And so it's not actually an example of Masonry. And maybe some of these sites, if Masonry existed, would take advantage of that, that display way of working. But for now, they seem to be doing it with Flexbox. The BBC layout, also not Masonry. Everything lines up neatly at the bottom. All of the little articles line up all the way across. That said, the right-hand column is not lining up with the core column, and so it's possible that that could be kind of a Masonry layout in there, although it's not done that way today. So when you design layouts with Masonry, there's a bunch of stuff you need to know about what works and what doesn't. Masonry is great at avoiding gaps. So like row-based grids are going to have a bunch of gaps between them. Masonry will minimize that white space and make the eye flow downward. So getting users to find additional content is relatively easier. But things won't line up vertically, and you can't need them to because it won't work out well. One thing it is good at is preserving the aspect ratio and cropping of images. Because Masonry holds one dimension steady, then the other dimension can flex, and you're able to combine a lot of different content without needing to do sort of aggressive cropping techniques. Jagged bottom edge, you've got to either live with it or like it, or find a way to make it work in your design. It's not something that you can really work around with Masonry. The other thing is the tab order can be kind of funky, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Not necessarily bad, just funky. And a Masonry layout is particularly cool because it's built on grid, and just like grid, it responds to your page without you necessarily having to write a bunch of media queries. The scroll direction is locked, though. So if you want to have a vertical Masonry, you can't really have horizontal scrolling within that box. Because when you add additional content, it's going to go below. And then similarly, if you have a horizontal Masonry, all the content is going to get added to the right side, and you need to have a fixed height, otherwise your content will sort of flow all over the place. Now, if we're going to have a good solution for Masonry, I know everybody's looking for like, what's the next thing someone's going to fight about around Masonry? But I think what we need to know is that, we all share the exact same goals. And if we want Masonry to be fast, we need to make sure that developers can easily build stuff that will be perceptibly fast by users. The other thing is we want to make sure it's easy to learn. It needs to make sense. It needs to be something you see it and you're like, oh, I get it. Like Flex is so powerful, but can I just say, I don't think you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I just get it. I think, at least for me, and maybe I'm the only one, but I still have to look stuff up years later and I'm like, wait, what did the what property do to the what? And now I see that Josh gets it. And so I'll try again. But I think ideally a goal for a layout model is that there's a sort of intuitive getting it when a developer looks at it. And I think one thing to take in mind is, and if you didn't get to see it, please check it out on video, Elika did a talk yesterday about standardization stories, and she sort of talks through how these APIs get this back and forth tug until they get to be something that really works for developers. So one question you might have is like, why put this in CSS? Like, what's the point of adding this to CSS? One of the reasons is because it's something that people really do a lot. So we see that there's increasing use in a bunch of popular NPM libraries. And maybe more importantly, there are a whole bunch of like long tail of Masonry packages out there that are, to some degree maintained or not. But doing this sort of thing, layout in JavaScript, is going to be necessarily slow. And so anytime we can look at a layout function and say, hey, there's a pattern here, and start thinking about how to get it to be declarative, we can make users' experiences faster. Why else? Because some of the core maintainers of these Masonry libraries are really excited to see this land in CSS. They feel like this is the right place for it to land. And after many, many years of maintaining the package, I think seeing interest from a large set of developers is pretty exciting for them. So let's build it. Elika made me add this slide. So 100% chance that this syntax will change. There are multiple versions, different opinions, but even if, what was in tech preview today, like we would still change stuff about it. We still see ways to improve it. So I think that see this as exciting, see it as something to play with. Don't build anything real on it just yet, but demos are very welcome. So again, let's go back to that most basic Masonry layout. We have columns, they're the same width. We have type packing and content with fixed aspect ratios. And it's images rather than text or anything like that that might need to respond to user preferences. So setting up a Masonry layout at the basic level is something that if you're familiar with grid, you're going to be extremely familiar with. So it sets the display type to grid, and then sets up your repeating columns. And then you add in a min-max so that it can figure out, the browser will essentially figure out between these two sizes how many of these items are going to fit in here, tell it autofill, so it will decide. And then it's a single line to get it to be masonry. So you just add grid template rows masonry, and then you'll get that nice sort of squished masonry look. I did leave one thing out. If you want the images to be properly responsive, you need to set them up to have the right aspect ratio. If you want it to have good loading behavior, you should also be thinking about providing widths and heights on the image elements themselves. So you might be thinking okay, sure, but could we build this with multi-call or something else? You could achieve a sort of similar layout, but there are disadvantages. So below the fold content is going to load before visible content. What we have at the top is the above the fold, and what we have below is below the fold. But what's going to happen is that little image at the bottom is actually going to load before the clearly more important content there at the top. In addition, I think this isn't the correct tabbing behavior. I mean, it is a tabbing behavior, but it's not ideal for users because you're tabbing down to clearly less important content before you get to the stuff that, arguably the largest piece of content above the fold is more important. So Masonry tabs differently. It tabs to content across the page, but you can see the order is pretty funky, right? It isn't exactly as you'd expect because Masonry content in general is placed in the next smallest column. And so you'll see that it goes initially across from left to right like it would with a grid, and then it jots a little back and forth in a zigzag. So what it does really well is it makes sure you tab first to the stuff that's visible. What is a little bit more challenging is whether or not that sort of zigzag would be hard to understand for users. We did get one request from the author of Masonry.js who said that people had asked them about horizontal tabbing from left to right. So whatever your layout may be, finding a way to tab left to right, more or less, and sort of keeping that consistent. The CSS working group is working on some similar ideas. I don't think any of them are quite ready to share yet, but hopefully we have a face-to-face next week. So going back to the creator of Masonry.js, he said the vast majority of users want uniform column width, that CSS grids provide much more flexibility than that, and that actually he doesn't think that 95% of the use cases need to have flexible column widths. I don't actually know if I agree with that. I mean, I think it's really good to take that information in. I do think that that tells us something about the use cases it's been used for now. That tells us something about what's been capable up until now, but that's different than what we want to make capable, which is a much sort of broader question about for you to answer, what do you want to design? What do you want to make that we haven't even thought of yet? Also, that code I showed you before and the design I showed you before is a little bit boring, right? I shouldn't say that. Jen Simmons made some amazing demos that I'm using in my talks, and she did a wonderful job, but having equal width columns is a little bit bland as the layout goes. It works for Pinterest, but I don't think it's going to work for everybody. So we wanted to look at what would it be like to start spanning columns so that we could have a little bit more visual interest. In this case, we decided, or Jen decided, to try having every fifth image span 2 columns. And so we set it up a similar way with autofill min-max and setting up the smallest and largest sizes for the columns that we'll accept. And then it's again, pretty basic if you've been doing grid layouts. You basically set the nth child to a grid column span of 2, and then every fifth image takes 2 lines. I love how simple this is and how many new sort of design ideas it can give us. I do want to say, though, that while it has more visual interest, you'll see that spanning columns also opened gaps. And so you want to work your design in a way that those gaps either contribute or sort of melt away. Just so that you have a sense of what the gaps can be like, I highlighted them in magenta here. So you'll see every little peekaboo coming through there. But what I will say is if you use a color that sort of disappears and melts away, like Jen did in some of her demos, I think you'll find that, the gaps are not nearly as troublesome as they seem. Next, we wanted to try variable width tracks. So we thought, spanning is great, but it's just one thing. We should look at what it would be like to be able to have variable width tracks. And Jen did something that I find super clever here. So she did a repeat of a small column and a large column, and then she ended with a small column, which means we get this really neat layout that goes from small to large, and always ends on another small. What's super cool about it is that you can see that same layout on a bunch of different screens, and it just works. Just like grid, Masonry is sort of naturally responsive, and that leads to good layouts without having to add a whole bunch of breakpoints. You can always add tweaks with your breakpoints, like, oh, hey, it looks a bit awkward here, I should do something with that. But no longer are you going to have breakpoint after breakpoint to set up something like this. We get a lot of requests for animations. So this is a developer called Chris Armstrong, and he said that the people using the libraries that he's worked with have asked for again and again to be able to have like predictive behavior when the user clicks on something within the Masonry. So you click on something, it expands, you should be able to tell what's going to happen. And so a lot of the libraries or the naive approaches do something like this, where a lot of times the thing you clicked on is bouncing out from under your mouse after you clicked on it. What he said is that users prefer something closer to this, which is that the element being clicked on stays in its spot and the other content reflows to go around it. Can we do this in CSS? We actually don't know. I didn't come here to tell you the things that we know. This is one where we don't know, and maybe by the end of next week we will know. But this is where I would love to hear from you. Is this stuff you want? Is this stuff you would use? Is animating this sort of layout important to you, or is it more of like a side feature? We also tried Masonry with some view transitions. You're obviously going to see it's very jumpy and very weird. But I think I'm pretty excited about seeing how in the future the two APIs could work together. So by now you might really be thinking that Masonry is all about photos and there's nothing else that you'd use it for. I promise that's not the case. So here, let's create an example of a layout in Masonry that'll get into also explicit placement of content. And this is another thing that a developer sent us. This was on a GitHub issue, and basically he said, yeah, but I want to do this thing. And I'll get into some of the details of it. But again, each one of these issues somebody opens, just like Roma was saying earlier, each one of these issues that somebody opens, or even a napkin sketch that you give us, helps us figure out how this stuff should work. Wow, that was a lot of animation. An unintentional amount of animation. So he said he recently came across a use case at work where he wanted a 2-column layout on desktop and a single column on mobile, and that the order on mobile wasn't really going to match what the desktop called for. And so I'll show you that visibly here. Basically, the items should be in the DOM order that we have here, and that's how they should be stacked on mobile. The ad we know is a fixed height and width, like ads unfortunately tend to be. And then we also know that on desktop or tablet, the secondary nav and ads should always be in the right-hand column. As well as, and this makes it more complicated, the banner is optional. So it can be there or not be there, and the layout has to work all the same. So let's start with some of the HTML structure. This is super basic, right? We've got a header and a footer, and then in between we have banner, secondary nav, content, and a little wrapper for whatever the ad was. The basic CSS is quite easy, and with just this, you've got a really solid mobile layout that just works. So you put display grid there, you pop on top of each other, and it's going to work really well. But it's not going to do what we want necessarily on desktop. And so we have to start using app media I picked out 720 pixels, but there are a million ways you could decide. That just seemed to work for a layout that had to have a big ad that couldn't move around very much. So yeah, at that breakpoint, I started adding in grid template columns 1FR and min content. The reason being because I really needed the secondary nav to shrink up around that ad and anything that happened to be in that nav. Again, it's the gap of 1 EM, just to make things a little bit easier in the demo. And then grid template rows set to masonry like we saw before. And that works, kind of, but it's missing a few things. As we grow and shrink the layout, we're going to swap between the two views, mobile and desktop views, and that does work. But it's also kind of naive. What we find is that the banner is going to, the layout will work perfectly as long as that optional banner is there. As soon as we remove and hide and show that optional banner, the entire page actually flops around in ways that aren't what we wanted. And so what we need to do to fix that is actually put that secondary nav explicitly in the second column, regardless of where the banner happens to be. So we do that by adding a grid column of 2 to the secondary nav. And as soon as we do that, we see that we get much better behavior out of it. It has the mobile view that we want, it has the tablet and desktop view that we want, and it works regardless of whether or not the banner is present. That said, I might have oversimplified a little bit. So the header and footer would actually be a total mess in this case, but I figured it was better to show you the core of the page first and get into the mess a bit later. So the header basically needs to span from the first grid line to the last grid line. So we need to add that bit of code in order to have the header take the full width. And then I had sort of thought that I could do similar things with the footer and kind of played around with different ways of doing it. But what I found was, when I did that, the footer being a placed element jumped up ahead of all the other content on the page, which was definitely not what I wanted. And so I had to do another think about how to get the footer to behave the way I hoped. And the thing that ended up working was actually just a grid column span of 2. Then it's not a placed element, it stays where it belongs, but it's going to take the full width wherever there's finally space available for it. So, huzzah! It kind of works. It basically works. And I think this is a good example of, masonry is not all about displaying photos. I think there are a whole bunch of different kinds of layouts that we could build that way. I do want to let you know about one particular piece that's sort of up for debate, though, because this is something where it would be really great for you to weigh in. The working group is sort of debating whether we should disallow mixing intrinsic and fixed size tracks. This means something like using min content on one side, which is content-based, and using 1FR on the other side. And 1FR could be any number of other unit-based sizes mixed with content. I think that it actually works really nicely here. I don't see another way that I would have done it that I would have been as happy with. That said, I do have some questions about whether this exact layout was best done in, in masonry, but I think it's a reasonable way to do it. So what I did in order to make that happen, and you probably saw it earlier, but I skipped over it a little bit, was basically set the grid template columns to 1FR and min content. So if that's something you think you would do, if you're immediately like, oh, that's a layout I would want, send us a sketch, send us anything, or just a note with what you think you would do with it is great too. Commenting on issues is fantastic. All the browser engineers love it when developers get on there and give examples of what they need. So I want to give you some more demos just to double, triple prove that this is not just an image thing. This is an example of a mega menu that, again, Jen Simmons built. She's on my team. You can see it shrinks up nicely to a single column, and then it spreads out all the way to fill. Actually, it has some breakpoints I didn't show because it would have been even wider on the slide. But yeah, it's extremely flexible, and it all works with masonry. She also built this cool demo, which is a sort of news site that can grow and shrink to different breakpoints and show the news off in ways that are sort of interesting, I think, at different sizes of device. So I think this one is a neat one to look at as well. I've showed a lot of demos. They're really cool. You might want to try to break them or make your own, share it with us. This will lead you to all of Jen's demos. And I think anything you can tell us about what works or doesn't work for you about these demos would be fantastic. And they all work in Safari Tech Preview. But yeah, keep in mind this index will change. And so, yeah, play with it. We have gotten, so even just being here at this conference, we've actually gotten a bunch more feature requests. And now we have no idea if these are viable or if they're anything we can do, but I loved that people were coming up and sharing them, and so I wanted to share them with you today. So I talked to Josh Tumath, and he said that he thought Masonry could be useful on live updating news pages. So it would be things like pages for footballers or stuff like that where there would be results and updating articles constantly coming in. Talking to Roma, he said this feels like two features, dimensionality and flowing things into slots simultaneously, and he wondered what it would be like to pull those apart. He also wants to be able to do some rows in a grid and some rows in a masonry or vice versa. I'm looking forward to getting more information about what that will be used for. And then finally, on the GitHub issues, a developer also suggested this, which is like, what if your layout could collapse in both directions at once? So it's like, I don't even know what to call it. Elika thought a word cloud would be a reasonable thing that you could do this way, but okay. But I think it's really neat, and like maybe we should consider whether it's something developers would want to do. So if you can think of like a cool use case for you to be like, oh, I would do that. I want to hear it, because for each one of these, they're like, we get one little signal that it's important, but more signals would help us out a lot. So one thing that's interesting is, whether we would have masonry flow in both directions. So currently, masonry is activated by setting grid template rows or grid template columns to masonry, but it's not valid to do both. And so that layout that we just saw, should we make it valid to do both? Is that a reasonable thing? Tons of open questions. But I want to kind of help you think through some of the things the working group is thinking about and we at Safari are thinking about. So, each one of these options for how we would manage this API has pros and cons. If you're familiar with grid, if we build it on grid, then that familiarity would transfer over. You would naturally understand masonry. Like you saw, there aren't really masonry properties in that version. You'd have the power of grid and extending it to make new kinds of layouts. It would enable some creativity. And you could consider that use case of mixing grid and masonry layouts, though I will admit it scares me a fair bit. On the con side, grid props do different things when they're set to masonry, and that could be a bit confusing. And I think, actually, Josh really nailed this. I think historically, devs haven't been great at understanding when one property changes the behavior of another property, and so that's something that we need to think about as well. For the masonry display type, if you're used to switching display types, inline, flex, grid, that sort of thing, it's going to be familiar to you. It'll be easy to search for masonry properties in this version, right? If you're like, why is my thing not working? And you search for masonry dash something, you'll get masonry dash content. Especially if it's its own thing, it gets easier to syntactically, wow, that's a word, disallow slow stuff that we don't want to support. And I'll get into some of what's slow in a bit. On the con side, developers would need to learn a whole new set of properties. It's similar to grid, but not quite grid, and that could be awkward as well. And you couldn't do all of the yummy goodness of grid necessarily. So there's also some quirks to think about with grid and masonry. So it can change which values and which properties are allowed and what number of values and properties are allowed inside of them. And so it's really quite an interesting and difficult sort of conundrum we have to work through, right? So one is duplication is pretty weird. If you have masonry area and grid area, they overlap a lot. They do a lot of the same thing. It could be confusing to have two more properties or another property that does basically the same thing. On the other hand, It can be confusing to have behaviors vary in a single property. So masonry supports 2 values for masonry area or grid area, and grid has 4 placement properties. So it's a little bit awkward because you'd have the same property doing 2 different things. So again, like, which one's better? I'm not always sure. Like, I actually am literally going back and forth a lot. But I do think there's a lot of value in the use cases that grid unlocks. So if you also feel a little unsure what to think about the different options, I think there's a better question to be thinking about, which is what kind of layouts are you inspired to make? The working group will figure out if your designs are gritty or masonry-y, and you don't have to worry about that. And so I think just keeping in your mind like what you want to make will help the work go forward the best. Obviously, it needs to be fast. We can't have a solution that's going to load slowly. And the trouble is that a lot of the slowness comes with really big DOM. But here's the thing. I was a developer, and I know what you're going to do, because it's what I did. And you're going to end up with really big, nested, huge, unruly DOM. It's just the nature of it. Even if you're careful about your part, someone else on another team plugs something into your template, and then all of a sudden you've got chaos. And so it isn't viable to think about this in a way where we would limit the amount of DOM it could apply to. So when we think about like why grid and masonry perf is different, because that's one of the sort of arguments going around, grid places items into the grid and then sizes the tracks. So that's one way to do it. Masonry sizes the tracks before placing the items. And so that really changes the paradigm for what's going to be fast and what's going to be slow. What that means is that for masonry items, you have to actually try them in every place they could possibly go so that you can figure out you can figure out where they would place and that they would fit in any possible spot they could go. Sorry, that was a very awkward way to say that. Anyway, so all of these are going to affect large collections, which is big DOM. If you have something small, have at it, do whatever you want. It's going to be fine. But we need to think about that. So what are some of the things that get slow when we're in that set of cases where we have large collections? One is dense packing when you have variable width columns. So dense packing, I think, is a great feature, but I shouldn't bias you because this is a place where we want feedback. But I think it looks really neat. It's the idea that if your masonry collapsed in various ways and it left holes, we would go in with smaller content that we found and fill in those gaps. And so you would have less of the magenta that you saw in the previous version. So personally, I think that's nice, but like, do you want it? We need to know. Because if you want it, then we need to figure out how to make it work and how to make it fast. Another one is content sizing for explicitly placed items. So this is like the sidebar that I explicitly placed in the second column. We have an open question of whether they should influence the size of their own track like grid does, or whether they could influence the size of every track, just like auto-placed items. So, it's another question that we'll be thinking about. And I brought this up before, but mixing intrinsic and fixed track sizes. What if you couldn't mix auto or min content with percentages and links and FRs when you have content that spans columns? So for each one of these things, any one of the things might not be so bad, might not be so expensive perf-wise, but it's when you combine them and you did this plus this plus this, you get into a case where the browser had to check a lot of different cases before it was able to figure out where to put the content. So I think we're going to need to look at performance concerns around non-uniform tracks, including content size tracks and spanning, and when all of that happens together. So is it a grid thing or a masonry thing? I don't know. You tell me. So we have the syntax on the top. It builds on top of grid. And so you can see it's a display grid, just like you saw in my examples. It's grid template columns. In this case, I set it to some random values just for the example. And then in the secondary nav, you have a grid column of 2. You can see that the main thing is I set grid template rows to masonry. Otherwise, it's a perfectly normal grid layout. The one below it is more of a masonry display type. And so this would set display to Masonry, and then every one of your properties that you worked with would be Masonry dash. So Masonry dash template tracks or Masonry dash track. So is it philosophically a grid or not? I think I'll leave that up to you after everything that you've heard. But I do want to leave you with how you can help. So you can help us answer the question of what could this API do? What should it do? And what will you make it do that we didn't picture, that we should know about, so that we can make sure it's fast? And remember that word, VC, right? One day I said it, and I said it without even thinking about it. And this happens to everybody who works on standards or works in a browser, especially if you used to be a web developer, is you have to have that aha moment where you realize that you can't trust your own intuition fully anymore. And the thing to do is to go to developers and ask them what they need and how they will use stuff. So please reach out with mock-ups of things you want to make with Masonry. Something simple to something complex. You might think yours is too simple, but it probably isn't. It would probably still be helpful to us. Some of the examples I showed today didn't look that complicated, right? But they caused really, really good conversations within folks thinking about the future of CSS. And so also, we don't need anything in particular. You don't have to have coded something, but you can. You don't have to have designed something, but you can. You can give me a napkin with a sketch on it of a thing you want to do, or shoot me a Twitter message or whatever social network. I'm on them all. I'm happy to get it in any which way you can provide that information. It doesn't have to be perfect. As Roma was saying, I think the more you get involved, the more issues you open, the more thoughts you give, the better the process goes. So please get over that barrier of thinking probably your thoughts aren't quite good enough, because they absolutely are. Thank you so much. This is a link to me, to my blog, which has links to all the socials, because I can't decide what the heck to do with that anymore. But thank you so much for having me.